Father Scully, to you and to everyone here at ACE, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I am truly honored to be here, and it is a pleasure. But even more importantly, thank you for all that ACE does for the church in the training of ACE teachers and principals, and for 20 years, such a blessing. Thank you. And thank you to all of you all who are involved in ACE, and a special shout out to the superintendent of Catholic schools of the Archdiocese of Mobile, Gwen Bird, who from the beginning, we were fortunate to be one of the first places that ACE came. And I know Miss Bird for 20 years has valued that and been a wonderful collaborator with ACE. Oh. Today, I just thought I would share a few stories with you, all of which are true. And the first story I thought I would share is a story that took place in the parish where I was stationed as a young priest. And one of our parishioners, he had a nice home. He was very proud of his home. But what aggravated him is that right next door to his home was an empty lot which was littered with trash, overgrown with weeds. And he was so frustrated that this unsightly mess was right next door to his home. So he contacted the owner of the lot. And he said, "Do you mind if I use your lot for a garden?" And the owner of the lot said that he had no objection. He said he had no plans for the lot. So the man hauled away the trash, cut down the weeds, tilled the ground. The result of all his hard work was a beautiful garden. And one day, the pastor said to the man, "You know, it's amazing what you and God have done with this empty lot." And the man said, "Well, what God and I have done with this lot," he said, "Father, that may be so, but you should have seen this lot when God was taking care of it by himself." God does not want to take care of the empty lots by himself. He wants to use us as his instruments. He wants us to go out, and as we just heard in the gospel, to be willing to serve, not to be served, and to make the world a little better because we're in it. And I thank you who are involved with ACE for your willingness to go out and be God's instruments in such an important ministry as education, Catholic education, because it is desperately needed. Let me tell you another story. About almost 50 years ago, I went to college. Ooh, 50 years ago. Some of you are going, "Whoa, was that a long time ago?" Yeah, it was just about the time that the wheel was invented, fire was discovered. It was a great time to be alive. Anyhow. And in the little Louisiana town in which I lived, there was a sugar refinery. And the owner of the refinery had a policy that any young man in town who was going to go to college was guaranteed a job in that refinery for the summer. God bless him. And it was a good-paying job. We college students got paid just like anyone else. We got paid the equivalent of almost 3 times minimum wage. In today's dollars, that would be about $20 an hour. Not bad for a college student. All we had to do was agree that we would work 7 days a week, 10 at night to 6 in the morning. No problem. Saturday and Sunday, that was time and a half. My favorite day to work was July 4th. That was double time. $40 an hour today. Can you imagine a college student being paid that? But anyhow, it was hot, heavy work. Basically, the sugar was in boilers and granulated, and then as soon as it came out of the boiler, we put into 100-pound bags or 10-pound bags, 5 2-pound bags, and bundled them up to be shipped out to wherever they were going. There was a thermometer there. I know it never got below 100 degrees where we were working. We were college students, so we made a game of anything, you know. But we were also working with year-round workers. I'll tell you a little bit about these year-round workers. Right after World War II, agriculture became mechanized. And up to that time, agriculture had been labor-intensive. And all of a sudden, thousands of people who had worked in agriculture no longer had a job. And so what do people do in that situation? Usually, most move to the cities looking for a job. Atlanta, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago. Well, some of those workers found a job in the refinery in our town. They hadn't needed an education to work in agriculture. And they found jobs where they still didn't need an education. And they were totally uneducated. They couldn't read or write. They couldn't sign their name. Payday, they'd just make an X, the foreman would sign next to their name. They couldn't tell time. Breaks had to be announced because they'd never learned how to read a clock. But they were good guys, hardworking guys, making a decent living. They owned their homes. They raised their families, even though they were totally uneducated. Well, I've been back to that place where as a college student I worked. And today, in what used to be a hot, dirty, miserable place where about 20 men were laboring, today it's air-conditioned, spotless. And there's only one person in there. There's a lady sitting at a computer console. Everything's mechanized, everything's computerized. One person doing the work of what 20 men used to do. And my point of telling this story is that story has been replicated across our country. And what used to be decent work, decent salaries for people who were uneducated, these unskilled, low-skilled positions are rapidly disappearing. And it's understandable today if some young people are so angry because they know that their grandfather could find work, but they can't, and they feel that society's against them, the deck is stacked against them. The difference is that today, to find a job, one has to have an education. And it's not surprising that there's a direct correlation between graduation rates and incarceration rates. Young people have to have an education. And you are going out to be God's instrument for those young people to get an education. But more than that, you're also going out to make sure those young people have a formation. And that's the unique gift of Catholic schools. The Catholic schools offer both education and formation. Offer students the knowledge that comes from education, and you will help young people to discover and begin to develop their God-given talents. But you also offer a formation and the wisdom to know what is truly important, truly lasting, the wisdom that comes from gospel values. And knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. I know people who have tremendous amount of knowledge enough to do brain surgery, but have very little wisdom of what's really important really lasting, what's right and what's wrong. And I know people who have very little knowledge, very little formal education, but have great wisdom. Catholic schools offer both. The knowledge to learn about this world that God has made, and the wisdom to enter into a relationship with the God who has made this world, to know, love, and serve Him. The skills to be able to make a living, and the wisdom to be able to build a life, and a life that begins here but lasts into all of eternity. And you will be able to do that by what you say, by what you do, by the example you give. You know, young people really have very low expectations of adults. You know, they shrug, you're adult, you know. And they really overlook so many of our foibles. But one thing a young person will not overlook is if a young person feels that an adult is phony, if an adult is not really meaning what he or she says. And kids are psychological geniuses at being able to look at adults and figure out, do you really mean what you're saying? And your example will be watched by your students. I'll tell you this story. I was in high school the day President Kennedy was assassinated. For vast majority of you all here, that's ancient history. Well, world moves on. Your students that you're going to have in your classroom will probably have no recollection of 9/11. The world moves on. But I remember exactly where I was, as anyone alive that day probably can. We were in PE class. We were in the gym. And over the loudspeaker came the announcement that President Kennedy had been shot. Our coach stopped PE class, told all of us, we were in an all-boys Catholic high school. He told us, go sit on the bleachers. And with that, he said, we're going to pray the rosary for the president. And with that, he took out his rosary. Whoa. Remember, can you imagine the impact that that had on that group of 14-year-old boys? Coach carries a rosary. I never told Coach what an impact that made on me. I still carry a rosary. Thank you, Coach. The kids watch us to see our example. I don't know about you all, but the teachers I remember, I don't remember so much for what they taught me. And I know they taught me, all right? But what I do remember about the teachers I recall fondly are two things. Two things, you know. And one was how they made me feel about myself. And the other was their example. I guess just gave you the story of that coach who gave me an example. My favorite teacher I still remember in high school. And he would just talk to me sometimes, just in passing. And what it told me, and just what he said to me, is one, he was really interested in my welfare. And second, he thought I was talented, that I had something that I could develop. And he would talk to me sometimes just about, what are you going to do in the future? You know? He would just say, oh, you can handle this, you can do that. He made me feel good about myself. I remember one time going to a talk, and the gentleman who was speaking shared with the group that when he was a kid, his parents had sent him to different schools until finally they enrolled him in a Catholic school. And he shared with us that he heard in a Catholic school two things he had never heard before. And the two messages he heard in a Catholic school that were new to him was, one, you can succeed. And the second, you are loved. And that's the genius of Catholic schools. In Catholic schools, it is not an option whether you're going to learn this. You're going to learn it. Because you have God-given talents and you can succeed. And the second, you are loved. There is a God who loves you. And you know, those two messages, you can succeed and you're loved, are not necessarily messages that young people hear anywhere else. And that's tragic. And very often they don't even hear that at home. And how life-transforming it is for a young person to hear it and believe that the person who's telling them that believes it too. We don't know the backgrounds, the home situations for our students. When I was a pastor one time, we were getting close to graduation for the 8th grade. And I made it very clear to the principal, to the students, to the families, that unlike the previous year, this year we were starting on time. That's my temperament. Deal with it, all right? And I made that very clear for the weeks leading up to graduation. Well, graduation night comes. It is time to begin. I say to the principal, let's start. She says, can we wait a while? Oh, I said, no. We said we were going to start on time. She says, one of the 8th graders is not here yet. I said, I'm sorry. It made very clear we were starting on time. What possible excuse could she have not to be here? The principal says, well, her mother's on drugs and is passed out. And the little girl called just a few minutes ago crying. She wants to come to her graduation. One of the teachers has gone to pick her up. I said, okay, we'll wait. But next year we're starting on time. There's nothing we can do about those home situations. Teachers, you are not the parents of your students. And don't try to be. That's not healthy. But we can give life-transforming messages in the classroom to those students. We can love those students with a Christian love and demand that they treat each other as God wishes us to treat one another. We can transform lives. And that's what Catholic education is about. Bottom line, Catholic education is about the salvation of souls. To awaken in our students the awareness that God has created them, loves them, has given them talents and abilities, and wants so much to enter into their lives now and for all of eternity. You are a diverse group, and none of us are perfect. Our first reading from Corinthians told us we're earthen vessels. But we're the instruments God wants to work with. We're diverse, different. You know, if you've ever been in a carpenter shop, there's all sorts of tools there to do all sorts of different things. Well, the carpenter of Nazareth uses different tools too. And each one of us, God wants to use. Now, I began by telling that story about the empty lot. That God wants to work through us to make the world a little different. God wants to work through you to make the world a little better. And I thank you. And I pray with you and for you as you go forth into the ministry of Catholic education to truly be God's instrument in the lives of your students.